An elderly couple bought gas station coffee and a map they could barely read, then drove 6 hours into the Colorado mountains following coordinates from a dead man's letter. And what they found inside a sealed government facility didn't just change their lives. It exposed a 40-year cover-up worth $295 million. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The kitchen table in the small ranch house on the edge of Pinewood, Colorado, had seen better days. The laminate top was chipped at the corners, and one of the legs wobbled every time someone leaned on it. But it held. It always held. Just like Harold and Margaret Fletcher had held on through 43 years of marriage, 3 kids, 2 grandchildren, and more struggles than either of them cared to count. Harold sat at that table on a cold March morning, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. He was 71 now, though his driver's license still said 70 because he kept forgetting to update it. His hair had gone white years ago, but his eyes, pale blue and sharp, still carried the intensity of a man who had spent his life solving problems underground. He had been a mining engineer back when that meant something in Colorado, back when the mountains still gave up their secrets, and men like him knew how to coax them out safely. He had worked the deep shafts, the dangerous tunnels, the places where one wrong calculation could bury a crew under 1 million tons of rock. He had been good at it. Damn good. But the mines had closed. One by one, through the 80s and 90s, they had shuttered their gates and laid off their workers. Harold had watched entire towns empty out, families packing up their lives into U-Hauls and driving towards cities that promised jobs that actually paid. He had stayed. Pinewood was home, even as it shrank from 8,000 people to barely 2,000. Even as the schools combined grades and the hospital became a clinic and the grocery store became a gas station with a few shelves of canned goods, now he lived on a fixed income. Social Security and a small pension that seemed to shrink every year while everything else got more expensive. Margaret's medical bills had started piling up 2 years ago when the doctors found the tumor. Benign, thank God, but the surgery and follow-up treatments had drained their savings faster than water through a cracked dam. They were behind on the mortgage. 3 months behind. The bank had started sending letters. The polite kind at first, then the stern kind, now the kind that used words like foreclosure and final notice. Margaret walked into the kitchen, moving slowly. She was 68, smaller than she used to be, her frame delicate in a way that made Harold's chest ache. Her hair, once deep brown, had gone silver grey, and she wore it short now because it was easier to manage. She had been a nurse for 35 years before she retired. She had steady hands and a steady heart, and she had saved more lives than she could count in the emergency room of the county hospital. She sat down across from Harold, her own coffee mug cradled in both hands. Neither of them spoke for a while. They had been married long enough that silence was comfortable. Then Harold pushed the envelope across the table. It had arrived 3 days ago, forwarded from an address he hadn't used in 20 years. The return address was a law office in Denver. Inside was a letter on heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that felt expensive between your fingers. Margaret picked it up and read it slowly, her lips moving slightly with the words. Dear Mr. Fletcher, I am writing to inform you of the passing of Mr. Vincent Alexander Crane, who listed you as a beneficiary in his final will and testament. Mr. Crane passed away on November 14, 2025, at the age of 76. As per his wishes, I am enclosing a personal letter he wrote to you, as well as a key and a set of coordinates. Mr. Crane was very specific that these items be delivered to you personally. He left no explanation, only the instruction that you would understand. Please contact our office if you have any questions. Sincerely, Thomas R. Whitmore, Attorney at Law. Margaret set the letter down and looked at Harold. Vincent Crane? Harold nodded slowly. I worked with him back in 76, 77, maybe 78. He was part of a special project up in the mountains, government contract. I only worked with him for about 8 months before I got pulled to another site. What kind of project? Harold shrugged. They never told us much. Something to do with mineral research. Rare earth elements, I think. Vincent was the lead geologist. Smart guy. Kept to himself mostly. We got along because neither of us talked much. Margaret picked up the second envelope, the one that had been sealed with actual wax. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Harold, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I don't have much time left, and there are things that need to be said. Things I should have said 40 years ago. You were the only one who understood why I stayed behind when the project shut down. You never judged me for it. You never asked questions you knew I couldn't answer. I've been the caretaker of something important for a very long time, something that was forgotten by the people who should have remembered. I'm leaving it to you now because I trust you to do the right thing. The coordinates will take you to the facility. The key will get you inside. What you find there is yours. Not because you deserve it, though you do, but because I know you won't let it disappear again. I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye in person. I hope you're still the man I remember, the one who gave a damn about doing things right. Vincent. Harold read over Margaret's shoulder, his jaw tight. When he finished, he sat back down heavily. What facility? Margaret asked. I don't know. Harold ran a hand over his face. Vincent stayed up in the mountains after the project ended. I heard rumors he was still working up there, maintaining something. But I figured it was just talk. The government shut the whole operation down in 79. Budget cuts. I thought they cleared everything out. And he's been up there all this time. Harold nodded. 40-some years. Alone. Margaret looked at the envelope again. There was something else inside. She tipped it out onto the table, a key, heavy and old-fashioned, made of brass that had tarnished to a deep gold green, and a small piece of paper with numbers written in Vincent's shaky hand. 39.4271 north, 106.1983 west. Coordinates, Harold said quietly. To what? Harold picked up the key, turning it over in his calloused fingers. To whatever Vincent's been protecting all these years. They sat in silence again. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. March in the mountains was cold and unpredictable. Snow one day, sun the next. The roads would be rough. We can't afford this, Margaret said softly. We can't afford gas for a wild goose chase. Harold knew she was right. They had $47 in their checking account until his Social Security check came in next week. The truck needed an oil change. The heating bill was due. But he also knew that Vincent Crane hadn't been the kind of man to waste anyone's time, and if he had spent 40 years protecting something, it had to matter. What if it helps? Harold asked, looking at his wife. What if whatever's up there could help us? Margaret met his eyes. She had always been the practical one, the one who balanced the checkbook and rationed the groceries and said no when Harold wanted to take risks. But she had also been the one who held his hand in the dark when things got bad. And right now, things were bad. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were thin and cold. When do we leave? She asked. They left before dawn the next day. Harold loaded the truck with supplies, a thermos of coffee, sandwiches Margaret had made from the last of the bread and lunch meat, a flashlight, a crowbar, his old work gloves, and a wool blanket in case they broke down. The truck was a 1998 Ford F-150 that Harold had bought used in 2003. It had over 200,000 miles on it, and the passenger side door didn't always latch right, but the engine still ran strong. Margaret wore her heavy coat, the one with the fake fur collar, and she had wrapped a scarf around her neck. She held the piece of paper with the coordinates in one hand and a gas station map in the other, squinting at it in the dim light of the cab. I can't read this, she muttered. Harold had punched the coordinates into an old GPS unit one of his sons had given him for Christmas 5 years ago. It still worked, barely. The screen was cracked, but it showed a route leading northwest into the mountains, toward a part of the range Harold hadn't thought about in decades. They drove through Pinewood as the sun crept over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The town looked smaller every time Harold really looked at it. Half the buildings on Main Street were boarded up. The diner where he used to eat breakfast had closed last year. The hardware store had become a thrift shop that was only open on weekends. Margaret watched the empty streets pass by. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked. Harold didn't answer right away. He guided the truck onto the highway, heading north. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but leaving felt like giving up." Margaret nodded. She understood. She always had. They drove for 2 hours before they had to stop for gas. The station was one of those lonely places that sat at a crossroads in the middle of nowhere, the kind with 2 pumps and a building that sold stale coffee and beef jerky that could double as shoe leather. Harold filled the tank while Margaret went inside. She came back with 2 cups of coffee and a map that actually had the current year on it. "The lady inside said we're headed toward old mining country," Margaret said as she climbed back into the truck. "She asked if we were historians or something." "What did you say?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I said we were looking for something we lost a long time ago." They continued west, leaving the highway for smaller roads, then leaving those for dirt roads that wound up into the mountains. The truck bounced and rattled over ruts and rocks. The trees grew thicker, pine and aspen crowding close to the narrow track. Harold's hands were tight on the wheel. He hadn't been up in this part of the range since the late 70s. It looked different now, wilder, like nature had spent 40 years taking back what humans had borrowed. The GPS beeped. "Destination in 1/2 mile." Margaret leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "I don't see anything." "It's here," Harold said. Vincent wouldn't lie. They rounded a curve and the trees opened up slightly. Ahead, built into the side of the mountain itself, was a structure that looked like it had been designed to disappear. Concrete walls painted in mottled green and brown, narrow windows covered with heavy shutters, a flat roof covered in dirt and scrub brush. It looked like an old mining office, the kind that had been abandoned decades ago. But Harold knew better. "This is it," he said, bringing the truck to a stop. They sat for a moment, engine idling, both of them staring at the building. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked. Harold looked at the coordinates on the GPS, then at the structure. "I'm sure." He turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy. No birds, no wind, just the ticking of the cooling engine and their own breathing. Harold grabbed the flashlight and the crowbar. Margaret took the key. Together, they walked toward the facility. Up close, it was clear the building was much larger than it appeared. Most of it was built into the mountain, with only the entrance visible. The door was steel, painted the same camouflage colors as the walls. There was a keyhole, old-fashioned and substantial. Harold tried the handle first. Locked solid. Margaret held up the key. Her hand was shaking slightly. "You okay?" Harold asked. She nodded. "Just cold." He knew it wasn't just the cold. He was scared too. Scared of what they might find. Scared of what they might not find. Scared that this whole trip was a waste of the last money they had. But he also knew they had come too far to turn back now. Margaret slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. She turned it, and something inside the door clicked, heavy and final. Harold pulled the handle. The door was heavy, designed to seal tight, but it swung open on hinges that were still well oiled. A rush of air came out, stale and dry, carrying the scent of metal and dust and time. Beyond the door was darkness. Harold clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the black, revealing a corridor that stretched back into the mountain. The walls were concrete, reinforced with steel beams. The floor was smooth, dusty but intact. "Lights," Margaret said, pointing. Harold found the switch panel beside the door. He flipped the first switch. Nothing happened. He tried the second, then the third. On the fourth switch, something deep in the building hummed to life. A generator, old but still functional. Lights began to flicker on down the corridor, one after another, revealing the path ahead. Harold and Margaret looked at each other. "Vincent kept the power running," Harold said quietly, "all these years." They stepped inside. The corridor was longer than it looked, sloping gently downward into the mountain. Doors lined both sides, each marked with faded stencils. Storage A, Storage B, Laboratory 1, Laboratory 2, Analysis, Records. Harold opened the first door. Inside was a small room filled with shelves. The shelves held equipment, all of it carefully wrapped in plastic and labeled. Geiger counters, spectrometers, drilling bits, core sample containers. Everything was organized, everything was preserved. "He was taking care of it," Margaret whispered, "the whole time." They moved deeper into the facility. Each room they opened revealed more of the same. Equipment, supplies, documents stored in sealed containers. It was like walking through a time capsule. Posters on the walls advertised safety procedures from the 1970s. Calendars were frozen on months from 40 years ago. In what must have been a break room, they found a coffee pot still sitting on a counter, a mug beside it with a faded logo that read Pikes Peak Mining Supply. Harold picked up the mug. It was clean, recently washed. "He was here," Harold said. "Recently." Margaret found a newspaper on a small table. The date read October 9th, 2025, just 5 months ago. She opened it to a page that had been marked, an obituary section. One name was circled in blue ink. Crane, Vincent Alexander, age 76, services private. Harold stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. He marked his own obituary. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. He knew he was dying, and he stayed here anyway. They continued exploring. At the end of the main corridor, they found a stairwell leading down. A sign above it read, "Deep Storage, Authorized Personnel Only." Harold shone his flashlight down the stairs. They descended into darkness, deeper than the lights reached. "This is it," he said. "Whatever he wanted us to find, it's down there." Margaret gripped his arm. "Harold, what if this is dangerous? What if there's a reason he kept it secret all these years?" Harold looked at his wife. Her face was pale in the harsh fluorescent light, her eyes worried. He thought about the bank letters sitting on their kitchen table. He thought about the medical bills. He thought about 43 years of loving this woman and never being able to give her everything she deserved. "Then we find out together," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. They descended the stairs side by side, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as they went down. At the bottom, Harold found another light switch. This one worked immediately. The lights revealed a large room, much larger than anything above. It was carved directly into the mountain, the walls smooth stone reinforced with concrete arches, and in the center of the room stood a vault door. It was massive, the kind of door you would see in a bank or a military installation. Circular, steel, with a wheel lock in the center, and beside it, etched into a brass plate mounted on the wall, were 3 words, V. Alexander Crane. Harold approached the door slowly. There was no keyhole, just the wheel. He tried to turn it. It moved. Someone had left it unlocked. Harold gripped the wheel with both hands and turned. It was heavy, requiring all his strength, but it moved smoothly. Gears inside the door clicked and tumbled. After 6 full rotations, something inside released with a sound like a gunshot. The door swung open 6 inches. Harold and Margaret stood frozen, staring at the gap. Light spilled out from inside, soft and white. Harold pulled the door wider. The hinges, despite their size, moved silently. Inside was another room, smaller, climate-controlled. The air that rushed out was cool and dry, carefully maintained, and lining the walls, stacked on industrial shelving, sealed in clear containers marked with warning labels and serial numbers, was something that made Harold's breath catch in his throat. Rows and rows of metal ingots, each stamped with symbols and numbers. Palladium, platinum, refined rare earth elements. Boxes of what looked like circuit boards but far more complex than anything Harold had ever seen, labeled as prototype semiconductors. Containers of powder and crystalline structures, carefully sealed, marked with terms Harold barely understood. Lithium compounds, superconductor alloys, experimental substrates. And in the center of the room, on a desk that looked like it had been used recently, sat a laptop computer, its screen dark but its power light glowing green. Beside the laptop was a folder, a simple manila folder with Harold's name written on it in Vincent's handwriting. Margaret moved to the desk first. She opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were documents, lots of them. Inventories, lists, chemical analyses, market valuations, and on top, a handwritten letter. Harold, you made it. I knew you would. What you're looking at is everything the government left behind when they shut down Project Sentinel in 1979. They were in such a hurry to close the program and hide the budget overruns that they forgot to actually recover the materials. I was supposed to oversee the dismantling. Instead, I stayed. I maintained it. I catalogued it. I kept it safe. For 46 years, I've been the only person who knew this was here. I tried to tell them. I called, I wrote letters, I filed reports. They ignored me. Eventually, they paid me a small pension to stay quiet, so I did. But I never stopped maintaining this facility. I never stopped believing someone would care. The materials in this room are worth approximately $295 million based on current market values. I've done the research. I've kept detailed records. It's all on the laptop. Password is your birthday, month, day, year. I'm leaving this to you, Harold, because you're the only person I ever met who understood that some things are worth protecting, even when the world forgets they exist. I don't know what you'll do with this. Sell it. Donate it. Turn it over to the government. Whatever you choose, I trust it will be the right thing. I only ask one favor. Don't let my 46 years of work be for nothing. Make this matter. Your friend, Vincent. Harold had to sit down. His legs simply gave out and he sank into the chair beside the desk. $295 million. Margaret was reading over his shoulder, one hand pressed to her mouth. This can't be real, she whispered. Harold looked around the room again, at the rows of carefully labeled materials, at the meticulous organization, at the laptop that Vincent had maintained, updating records until he couldn't anymore. It's real, Harold said. God help us, it's real. They sat in silence, the weight of discovery pressing down on them like the mountain above. Somewhere far overhead, beyond tons of rock and decades of secrets, the sun was beginning to set over the Colorado mountains. And deep in the vault, surrounded by forgotten treasure and one dead man's faithful vigil, an elderly couple tried to understand how their lives had just changed forever. Margaret finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Harold, what do we do? Before he could answer, a sound echoed down from somewhere above, faint but unmistakable. An engine. Multiple engines. Someone else had found the facility. Harold froze, his hand still resting on Vincent's letter. The sound of engines grew louder, echoing down through the facility's corridors. Multiple vehicles moving slowly, carefully, like they knew exactly where they were going. Margaret's eyes went wide. Harold, we need to leave. He stood quickly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. But even as he moved, his engineer's mind was calculating. They were deep underground. There was only one way out, and whoever was coming in had already blocked it. The laptop, Margaret said suddenly. Grab the laptop. Harold yanked the power cord free and tucked the computer under his arm. Margaret scooped up the folder with his name on it, stuffing it inside her coat. Her hands were shaking, but her face had settled into the calm mask Harold had seen 1,000 times before. The nurse in her, The woman who had worked emergency rooms and seen every kind of crisis was taking over. "Is there another way out?" she asked. Harold looked around the vault, his flashlight beam sweeping the walls. He had worked enough underground sites to know that facilities like this sometimes had emergency exits, backup tunnels, escape routes. "There," he said, pointing to the far corner of the vault. Partially hidden behind a stack of supply crates was a steel door, smaller than the main vault entrance. It was marked with faded yellow and black stripes and a single word: evacuation. Harold crossed the room in 4 long strides. The door had a simple push-bar mechanism, the kind designed to open from the inside even if the power failed. He shoved it hard. The door groaned but didn't budge. He tried again, throwing his shoulder into it. Margaret joined him, both of them pushing together. The door shifted an inch, then 2, then suddenly gave way with a shriek of metal on metal. Beyond was darkness and the smell of damp stone. Harold clicked on his flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow tunnel carved through solid rock, sloping upward at a steep angle. Water dripped from the ceiling and the walls glistened with moisture. "It's a ventilation shaft," Harold said. "Probably leads to the surface somewhere on the mountainside." Above them, the sound of the engines stopped. Doors slammed. Voices echoed down the corridors, hard and professional. "Go!" Harold said, pushing Margaret ahead of him. She didn't argue. She stepped into the tunnel and started climbing, her hands finding holds on the rough walls. Harold followed, pulling the door shut behind them. It wouldn't lock from this side, but maybe it would buy them a few minutes. The tunnel was steep and treacherous. Margaret slipped twice, and each time Harold caught her, his heart hammering. The laptop dug into his ribs where he had it tucked under his coat. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as they climbed. Behind them, muffled by stone and steel, they heard voices in the vault. Someone shouted, then the sound of the evacuation door being wrenched open. "They know we're here," Margaret panted. "Keep moving," Harold urged. They climbed for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 15 minutes. Harold's legs burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was 71 years old, and his body was reminding him of every single year. Then Margaret stopped so suddenly that Harold nearly collided with her. "What is it?" "Light," she said. "I see light." Ahead, the tunnel opened into a small cave mouth. Daylight filtered through, weak and grey. They scrambled toward it, emerging onto a rocky outcropping about 200 feet above where they had parked the truck. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Below, they could see the facility entrance. And parked beside Harold's old Ford were 3 black SUVs, new and expensive-looking. Men in dark tactical gear were moving in and out of the facility, carrying equipment. They moved with military precision, organized and efficient. "Who are they?" Margaret whispered. Harold shook his head. "I don't know, but they're not here by accident." They crouched behind a boulder, watching. One of the men emerged from the facility, carrying what looked like a scanner of some kind. He was talking into a radio, his words inaudible at this distance. "We need to get to the truck," Harold said. "They'll see us." Harold studied the terrain. The mountainside was heavily wooded below the outcropping. If they were careful, they could work their way down through the trees and come up on the truck from the opposite side. "We'll go through the forest," he said. "Stay low, stay quiet." They started down, moving as quickly as they dared over the loose rock and scrub. Harold kept one hand on Margaret's arm, steadying her. The laptop bumped against his side with every step. Halfway down, Harold's boot slipped on wet leaves. He went down hard, sliding several feet before catching himself on a tree trunk. The laptop flew from under his coat, tumbling down the slope. "No," Harold hissed. He scrambled after it, leaves and dirt flying. The computer came to rest against a fallen log, its case scuffed but intact. Harold grabbed it, his heart pounding. Margaret had frozen above him, one hand pressed to her mouth. Harold climbed back up to her, breathing hard. "I'm okay," he managed. They continued down more slowly. By the time they reached the tree line near the facility, full darkness had fallen. The men had set up portable lights around their vehicles, casting harsh white circles in the gloom. Harold counted 6 men visible, but there could be more inside the facility. "The truck keys," Margaret whispered. "Do you have them?" Harold patted his pockets. There, in his right front pocket, the familiar shape of his key ring. They waited, watching the patterns of movement. The men seemed to be loading equipment into one of the SUVs. Whatever they were doing, they were taking their time. Then one of the men walked away from the group, heading toward the tree line, toward them. Harold pulled Margaret down behind a thick pine, both of them holding their breath. The man stopped 20 feet away and lit a cigarette. In the flame of his lighter, Harold saw a hard face, late 30s, with a scar running along his jawline. The man smoked slowly, looking up at the stars. Harold's leg was cramping. He shifted slightly, and a twig snapped under his boot. The sound was small, barely audible, but the man's head whipped around. He dropped the cigarette and reached for something at his hip. Margaret grabbed Harold's hand, squeezing tight. The man took a step toward them, then another. His hand came up holding a flashlight. The beam swept the trees, passing inches over their heads. Harold felt Margaret trembling beside him. He squeezed her hand back, a silent message. "Stay still." The flashlight beam moved away. The man stood for a long moment, listening. Then he shook his head and walked back toward the vehicles. Harold waited until the man had rejoined the others before he dared to breathe. "Now," he whispered. They moved through the darkness, circling wide around the facility. It took them 20 minutes to reach the truck, approaching from the far side where the shadows were deepest. Harold's hands shook as he unlocked the door. The click of the lock sounded impossibly loud. "Get in," he breathed. Margaret climbed in on the passenger side. Harold slid behind the wheel, setting the laptop on the seat between them. He put the key in the ignition and paused. "If I start it, they'll hear." Margaret looked at the facility, at the men moving in the light. "We don't have a choice." Harold turned the key. The old Ford's engine roared to life, loud as thunder in the quiet mountains. Instantly, shouts erupted from the facility. Flashlight beams swung toward them. "Go," Margaret said. Harold threw the truck into reverse, backing up wildly. He spun the wheel, the tires churning gravel, and shifted into drive. The truck lurched forward onto the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, he saw the men running toward their SUVs. "Hold on," Harold said. He pushed the accelerator to the floor. The old truck bounced and rattled over the rough road, headlights cutting through the darkness. Behind them, the SUVs roared to life, their high beams flooding the road with light. "They're following us," Margaret said, her voice tight. Harold gripped the wheel, every muscle in his body tense. He knew these roads from 40 years ago, but memory and reality were different things. The curves came faster than he expected. The drop-offs seemed steeper. One of the SUVs was gaining, its powerful engine easily overtaking the old Ford. Harold saw a turnoff ahead, barely more than a track leading deeper into the forest. He cranked the wheel hard. The truck skidded, fishtailing, then caught traction and plunged into the trees. Branches scraped the sides. The undercarriage banged against rocks and roots. Margaret braced herself against the dashboard, her face pale in the dashboard lights. The SUVs followed, but the narrow track slowed them down. Their wider bodies couldn't navigate the tight spaces as easily. Harold pushed forward, praying the old truck would hold together. The track climbed steeply, switchbacking up the mountainside. Then, without warning, the track ended. Harold slammed on the brakes. The truck slid to a stop at the edge of a small clearing. Beyond was nothing but forest, too thick to drive through. He looked in the mirror. The lights of the SUVs were coming up the track, maybe a quarter-mile behind. "We have to run," he said. They grabbed the laptop and climbed out. The night air was cold and sharp. Harold could hear the SUVs getting closer, engines growling. This way, he said, plunging into the forest. They ran, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. Harold kept one arm around Margaret, half carrying her. The laptop banged against his chest. Behind them, the SUVs reached the clearing. Doors opened, voices called out, coordinating. Then flashlight beams began sweeping the forest. Harold and Margaret kept moving, putting distance between themselves and the pursuit. The forest was dense here, the pines growing close together. It was hard to move quickly, but it also provided cover. They ran until Margaret couldn't run anymore. She collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. Harold knelt beside her, his own lungs burning. "You okay?" She nodded, unable to speak. He listened. The voices behind them had faded. The flashlight beams were distant now, searching in the wrong direction. They sat in the darkness, catching their breath. Harold's hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. "Who were those men?" Margaret asked when she could speak. Harold shook his head. "Government contractors, maybe? Or private security? Someone who knows about the facility. How did they find it?" Harold thought about the vault, about the security systems Vincent had maintained. "Maybe we triggered something when we opened it, some kind of alert." Margaret pulled the folder from inside her coat. It was crumpled but intact. "So what do we do now? We can't go home." They saw our truck. Harold knew she was right. Their license plate, their vehicle, it would lead whoever those men were straight to their house in Pinewood. "We need help," he said. "We need someone we can trust." "Who?" Harold thought for a long moment. Then he remembered. Elena. Who's Elena? Vincent's daughter. He mentioned her once, years ago. Said she was a professor somewhere. Geology, I think. How does that help us? Harold opened the laptop, the screen casting a pale blue glow in the darkness. The battery showed 68%. He typed in the password, his birthday, 031453. The screen unlocked, revealing a desktop organized with military precision. Folders labeled by year, by material type, by inventory status. Harold found what he was looking for in a folder marked Personal. Inside was a document titled Emergency Contacts. There was only one entry. Elena Crane, Professor of Geology, Colorado State University. Phone, email, address. Harold pulled out his old flip phone. No signal. They were too deep in the mountains. "We need to get to lower ground," he said. "Somewhere with cell service." They walked through the forest for over an hour, moving slowly, stopping often to listen. The pursuit had given up, or at least moved on. The night was quiet except for the wind in the pines and the distant sound of an owl. Finally, Harold's phone showed a single bar. He dialed the number for Elena Crane. It rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice, cautious. "Hello? Elena Crane? Yes, who is this?" Harold took a breath. "My name is Harold Fletcher. I worked with your father, Vincent, back in the 1970s. I'm sorry for your loss." Silence. Then, "How did you get this number?" "Your father left it for me. He left me something else, too. Coordinates to a facility in the mountains." Another pause, longer this time. "You found it?" "Yes." "And you opened the vault?" "Yes." "Then you're in danger," Elena said, her voice urgent. "Where are you?" Harold looked around at the dark forest. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Somewhere in the San Isabel Mountains. We had to run. There were men at the facility. Black SUVs, tactical gear. Yes." Elena swore softly. "Those are government contractors. Private security hired to clean up loose ends. My father warned me about them. They've been trying to find that facility for years. What do they want?" "What's inside?" Elena said. "The materials are worth a fortune. And some of the research, it's still classified. They can't let it get out." Harold felt Margaret grip his arm. "We have the laptop," he said. "Vincent's records." "Then you have everything," Elena said. "Evidence of 46 years of government negligence. Proof that they abandoned hundreds of millions in materials. Data that could embarrass a lot of powerful people. What do we do?" "Meet me," Elena said. "I'm in Fort Collins." There's a diner on the north edge of town, Rosie's. I can be there in 3 hours. Harold checked his watch. It was almost 10 at night. We'll try. Mr. Fletcher, Elena said, her voice softening. My father trusted you. He told me if anything ever happened to him, if anyone ever found that facility, it would be you. He said you were the only honest man he'd ever met in that whole corrupt system. Harold's throat tightened. Your father was a good man. He deserved better than he got. Yes, Elena said quietly, he did. Now let's make sure his 46 years meant something. The line went dead. Harold looked at Margaret, her face barely visible in the darkness. Can you walk to the main road? She nodded. I can walk. They hiked for another hour before they found pavement, a narrow 2-lane highway that wound through the mountains. They walked along the shoulder, the laptop tucked under Harold's coat, staying alert for headlights. A truck passed, then a sedan. Neither stopped. Then a set of headlights approached from behind, moving slowly. Harold tensed, ready to pull Margaret into the trees. But the vehicle that pulled over was a battered Toyota pickup, driven by a kid who couldn't have been more than 20. He had long hair and kind eyes. You folks broke down? He asked. Harold made a quick decision. Yes. Our truck died about 5 miles back. We're trying to get to Fort Collins. Hop in, the kid said. I'm headed that way. They climbed into the back seat, Margaret between Harold and the door. The cab smelled like fast food and motor oil. What brings you out here so late? The kid asked as he pulled back onto the road. Visiting family, Harold lied. Didn't realize how late it had gotten. The kid nodded, accepting the explanation. He turned on the radio, some kind of alternative rock station, and didn't ask more questions. Harold watched the road behind them, looking for black SUVs. But the highway stayed empty. They reached Fort Collins just after 1 in the morning. The kid dropped them at a gas station near the interstate. You folks need anything else? He asked. Harold pulled out his wallet. He had $32. He handed the kid a 20. For gas, we appreciate the help. The kid tried to refuse, but Harold insisted. When the Toyota drove away, Harold and Margaret stood under the harsh lights of the gas station. 2 elderly people in dirty clothes clutching a laptop worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Margaret bought coffee inside while Harold called a taxi. They waited on a bench outside, sipping the bitter gas station coffee and watching cars pass on the interstate. The taxi arrived 20 minutes later. Harold gave the driver the address of Rosie's diner. They pulled up to a small building with neon signs in the windows and a gravel parking lot. Only 2 other cars were there. Harold paid the driver with the last of his cash. Inside, the diner was bright and warm. A waitress with tired eyes directed them to a booth in the back. They had been sitting for 5 minutes when the door opened and a woman walked in. She was in her late 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and her father's sharp eyes. She wore jeans and a university sweatshirt, and she carried herself like someone used to field work. She saw them and walked over. Mr. Fletcher. Harold stood. Miss Crane. She slid into the booth across from them. Just Elena, please. You must be Mrs. Fletcher. Margaret, she said softly. Eleanor studied them both, and Harold saw her father in the way she looked at things, assessing, calculating. You made it. I wasn't sure you would. We got lucky, Harold said. Elena shook her head. Luck didn't get you out of those mountains with my father's laptop. That took grit. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Harold placed the laptop on the table between them. Your father left this for me, but I think it really belongs to you. Elena stared at it for a long moment. Then she opened it, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. She pulled up files, scanned documents, her expression growing more intense with each screen. "Do you know what you have here?" she asked finally. Harold shook his head. "Just what we saw in the vault. Materials, prototypes, research." Eleanor turned the laptop so they could see the screen. She had opened a spreadsheet, current market valuation of assets stored at Facility Sierra 7. The total at the bottom read $295,400,000. "That's based on current market prices for the rare earth elements," Elena explained. "The palladium alone is worth over $80 million. The platinum another 60. The experimental superconductors, if they actually work the way these notes suggest, could be worth double that to the right buyer." Margaret's hand found Harold's under the table. "But it's not just the materials," Elena continued. She pulled up another file. "These are research notes. My father documented everything. Breakthroughs in material science that were years ahead of their time. Medical applications for some of these compounds that could have saved lives." Harold leaned forward. "Why did the government abandon it?" Elena's jaw tightened. "Because in 1979 they were cutting budgets everywhere. The Cold War was winding down, or so they thought. Programs like this, civilian applications for military research, they were low priority. My father said they shut down Project Sentinel so fast that half the people involved didn't even know what they were abandoning. And Vincent stayed to protect it." Elena nodded. "He tried to tell them. He filed reports for years, but the bureaucracy buried him. Eventually, they paid him a small pension, basically hush money, to make him go away. He took the money and stayed anyway. Spent the rest of his life maintaining that facility, updating these records, hoping someone would eventually care." Harold thought of the lonely man he had known briefly 46 years ago, the one who had stayed behind when everyone else left, and now he's gone. Elena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He died 6 months ago, heart attack, alone in that facility. A hiker found him a week later and called the authorities. By the time I got there, they had already moved his body. I didn't even get to say goodbye. The three of them sat in silence for a moment. The waitress came by to refill their coffee and discreetly left them alone. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked. Eleanor closed the laptop. "We have 3 choices. 1, we turn this over to the government and let them deal with it. They'll probably classify everything again, bury it, and we'll never see a dime. 2, we go public. Call the press, leak these files, force them to acknowledge what they abandoned. It'll be messy. There will be investigations, lawsuits, maybe criminal charges. And 3, Elena met Harold's eyes. We find buyers, private companies that can actually use these materials. Tech firms, medical research labs, universities. We sell it legally, transparently, and use the money the way my father wanted, to make his work matter." Harold thought about the men in tactical gear, the black SUVs, the chase through the forest, and the government contractors. "They'll try to stop us no matter what we choose," Eleanor said. "But if we move fast, if we get everything documented and distributed before they can contain it, they won't be able to make it all disappear." Harold looked at Margaret. She was exhausted, her face drawn, but her eyes were clear. "What do you think?" She smiled faintly. "I think we didn't climb down that mountain and run through those woods to hand everything back to the people who forgot about it in the first place." Harold felt something settle in his chest. A decision made. He turned to Elena. "How do we start?" Eleanor pulled out her phone. "I have contacts. Geologists, materials scientists, university procurement officers, people who've spent years looking for exactly what my father was protecting. We start making calls at sunrise. Where do we go until then?" Elena stood. "I have a friend who owns a cabin about an hour from here, off the grid, no records, no paper trail. We can work from there." They left the diner as the first grey light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon. Elena drove them in her old Jeep, heading west into the foothills. Harold and Margaret sat in the back seat, the laptop between them like a sleeping child. Harold watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting them gold and orange. He thought about Vincent Crane, spending 46 years in that underground facility, waiting, hoping, believing that someone would eventually understand what he had protected. And now, against all odds, someone did. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, already half asleep. Harold kissed her hair gently. Whatever came next, they would face it together, just like they had faced everything else for 43 years. The jeep climbed into the hills, leaving the city behind, and in the growing light, Harold Fletcher allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Vincent's long wait had finally come to an end. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense pines, its weathered wood siding blending into the forest like it had grown there. Elena's friend wasn't home, off working on an oil rig in North Dakota, but she had a key and permission to use it whenever needed. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a loft bedroom accessible by a ladder. Harold helped Margaret up to the loft while Elena got the stove going. The laptop sat on the small wooden table like a ticking bomb. Harold came back down and stood by the window watching the road. Dawn was fully broken now, the sky pale blue and cloudless. "You should rest," Elena said. "Both of you." Harold shook his head. "We need to start making those calls." Elena poured coffee from a percolator she'd found in the kitchen. "Not yet. First, we need to make copies of everything. Multiple backups, cloud storage, external drives, everything. If something happens to that laptop, we lose all the leverage." She was right. Harold watched as she connected the laptop to her phone's hotspot and began uploading files to multiple secure servers. It took over an hour. While the files transferred, Elena made notes, compiling lists of contacts, potential buyers, journalists who might be interested in the story. Margaret came down from the loft, her hair damp from a shower. She looked better, more rested, though her eyes still carried the weight of the last 24 hours. Elena looked up from the laptop. "Mrs. Fletcher, I need to ask you something. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once we start making calls, once this goes public, there's no taking it back." Margaret sat down at the table. "My husband and I are 3 months behind on our mortgage. I have medical bills I'll never be able to pay. We were going to lose everything anyway. At least this way, we're fighting for something that matters." Elena nodded slowly. "My father would have liked you." Harold joined them at the table. "Who do we call first?" Eleanor pulled up a contact list. "I have a colleague at the Colorado School of Mines. He's been researching rare earth element sourcing for years. If I tell him we have access to refined palladium and platinum, he'll know people who need it." "Legitimate people?" Elena met his eyes. "I've spent my entire career in academic geology, Mr. Fletcher. I don't know any criminals. Everyone I'm going to contact is a scientist, a researcher, or a university procurement officer. People who work inside the system." Harold felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "Then let's start." Elena made the first call at 9:37 in the morning. She spoke carefully, professionally, mentioning she had come across documentation of rare earth materials from a defunct government project. She didn't mention amounts or locations, just enough to gauge interest. The response was immediate and intense. Her colleague asked if she could send specifications. She said yes, she could send everything by secure email within the hour. The second call went to a materials science professor at Stanford. The third to a medical research lab that had been looking for specific lithium compounds for battery development. By noon, Eleanor had made 8 calls. Every single one had responded with excitement and requests for more information. Harold watched her work, impressed by her efficiency and professionalism. This was a woman who knew her field, who had credibility and connections. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen and frowned. "I don't recognize this number." She answered on speaker. "Hello, Dr. Crane?" a man's voice said. Smooth, professional, dangerous. "My name is Richard Torres. I represent certain government interests related to Project Sentinel. Harold felt his blood run cold. Eleanor's face went blank. "How did you get this number?" she asked. "That's not important. What's important is that you and your associates cease all communications regarding materials recovered from Facility Sierra 7. We haven't recovered anything," Elena said carefully. "We're simply discussing historical research." Torres laughed, cold and humorless. "Dr. Crane, we have surveillance footage of Harold and Margaret Fletcher entering the facility yesterday evening. We have records of them removing a laptop containing classified information, and we're currently tracking your phone's location." Harold's hand moved instinctively to the window, scanning the tree line. "You have two options," Torres continued. "One, you return the laptop and all copied materials to us within 24 hours, sign non-disclosure agreements, and this all goes away. 2, we involve federal law enforcement, charge you with theft of government property, possibly espionage, and destroy your careers and lives." Elena's jaw tightened. "That facility was abandoned for 46 years. My father was the only person who maintained it, and you people ignored him until he died alone. Your father was paid to maintain security and silence," Torres said. "He violated that agreement by providing access codes to outsiders. He died trying to make his life's work mean something," Elena shot back. "And you can't classify something you forgot existed." "Watch us," Torres said. 24 hours, Dr. Crane." The line went dead. Margaret had gone pale. "Harold, they know where we are." Elena was already moving, grabbing the laptop, unplugging cables. "We need to leave, now. Where do we go?" Elena paused, thinking hard. Back to the facility. Harold stared at her. "That's the first place they'll look." "Exactly," Elena said. "They've already been there. They've already searched it. They'll expect us to run, to hide, to stay away. We go back, secure ourselves inside, and we make our stand there." "That's insane," Margaret said. Elena's eyes were bright with determination. "My father spent 46 years in that facility. He knew every inch of it, every system, every backup protocol. I grew up hearing about it. I know things those contractors don't, and it's the one place where we have the advantage." Harold thought about the blast doors, the sealed vault, the emergency systems. She might be right. If we can get inside and lock it down, they can't get to us without serious equipment. "And while we're locked in?" Margaret asked. "We keep making calls," Elena said. "We send everything to the media. We force this into the open before they can bury it again." Harold looked at his wife. She was scared. He could see it in her eyes, but she was also angry. Angry at a system that had forgotten Vincent Crane, angry at the medical bills and foreclosure notices, angry at a lifetime of being invisible. "Let's do it," Margaret said quietly. They packed quickly, taking only essentials. Elena disabled her phone's location services and powered it down. They left in her jeep, taking back roads, watching constantly for black SUVs. The drive took 3 hours, winding through mountain passes and forest roads. Clouds had begun to gather overhead, dark and heavy. The weather forecast on the radio mentioned a late-season storm moving in from the west, possible heavy snow above 8,000 feet. The facility was at 9,200 feet. They approached carefully, parking the jeep a quarter-mile away and hiking in through the trees. The black SUVs were gone. The facility looked abandoned again, the blast doors closed. Elena had a key, a copy her father had given her years ago. She unlocked the door, and they slipped inside. The interior was just as Harold remembered, but something felt different. Wrong. "They've been here," he said quietly. The dust had been disturbed, equipment moved slightly. Elena led them deeper into the facility, past the main corridors to a section Harold hadn't seen before. She stopped at what looked like a blank wall and pressed a series of points in a specific sequence. A section of wall clicked and swung inward, revealing a small room. "My father's actual living quarters," Elena said. "He showed me this when I was 16, made me memorize the code." Inside was a cot, a desk, a small kitchenette, and most importantly, a separate computer system with its own power supply and satellite uplink. This is how he monitored everything, Elena explained. Independent of the main facility systems. They can cut the power, jam the regular communications, but this will still work. Harold examined the setup. It was ingenious, a completely isolated network piggybacking on a commercial satellite system. Your father was brilliant. Elena's voice was tight. He was paranoid, and it turns out he was right to be. She powered up the system. It hummed to life, screens flickering on. While she worked, Harold and Margaret explored the small space. There were photographs on the wall, faded and yellowed. A younger Vincent with a woman who must have been his wife. A little girl with dark hair and sharp eyes. Elena. On the desk, Harold found a journal. He opened it carefully. The entries went back decades, daily logs of temperature, humidity, equipment status, but interspersed were personal notes. Thoughts about isolation, about duty, about wondering if anyone would ever care about what he was protecting. One entry from 5 years ago read, "Elena called today. She's teaching at the university. She thinks I'm crazy for staying here. Maybe I am. But if I leave, who will remember that this mattered? Who will make sure it doesn't just rot away?" Harold closed the journal, his throat tight. Outside, the wind had picked up. Through the narrow window, Harold could see the sky darkening. "Storm's coming," he said. Elena didn't look up from the computer. "Good. It'll slow them down." She had connected her phone briefly to upload the files from the laptop to the satellite system. Now she was composing emails, carefully worded messages to journalists, news organizations, government oversight committees. At 4:17 in the afternoon, she hit send on the first batch. 10 minutes later, her phone started ringing. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again and again. "They're getting the emails," she said. At 4:45, the facility's main power cut out. The lights died. The hum of the ventilation system stopped. Emergency lights kicked on, bathing everything in red. Harold moved to the blast door. Through the small reinforced window, he could see vehicles approaching. Not 3 this time, but 6, black SUVs and a larger truck. "They're here," he said. Elena kept working. The satellite system had its own battery backup. She was still online. Margaret joined Harold at the window. "What do we do?" "We wait," Harold said. "We make them work for it." Outside, men in tactical gear emerged from the vehicles. Harold recognized the one from the forest, the man with the scar on his jaw. He was talking into a radio, gesturing at the facility. A voice came over a loudspeaker, amplified and cold. "This is a federal security operation. You are occupying a restricted government facility. Exit immediately with your hands visible, and you will not be harmed." Harold didn't move. Elena kept typing. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The voice came again. "This is your final warning. Exit now or we will enter by force." Margaret's hand found Harold's. "We're really doing this." Harold squeezed back. "We really are." A loud bang echoed through the facility. They were trying to breach the blast door, but Vincent had maintained those doors for 46 years. They were solid. Elena looked up from the computer. "I just sent files to the Washington Post, the New York Times, CBS News, and 3 congressional oversight committees." Harold felt something shift in his chest. "It's done then." "Not yet," Elena said. "We need to give them time to actually look at the files, to verify the story. We need to hold out long enough for this to go public." Another bang, louder this time. They had brought cutting equipment. Harold moved through the facility, checking systems. He found the backup generator, still functional. He got it started, and the main lights flickered back on. In the vault, he stood among the rows of materials, the fortune Vincent had protected. He thought about his town, about Pinewood dying slowly, about jobs lost and families leaving, about what a fraction of this wealth could do if it was used right. He thought about Margaret's medical bills, about the grandchildren he wanted to help with college, about 43 years of scraping by and never quite making it. But mostly he thought about Vincent Crane, alone in this mountain, believing that integrity mattered even when no one was watching. Harold sealed the vault and made his way back to the hidden room. Snow had begun to fall outside, thick and heavy. The storm had arrived. The cutting equipment stopped. Through the window, Harold saw the men retreating to their vehicles. The storm was too intense. They would have to wait. "We bought some time," he said. Elena was on the phone now, her expression intense. "Yes, I can verify everything in those files. My father kept meticulous records for 46 years. No, I'm not alone. I'm with Harold and Margaret Fletcher. They're the ones my father trusted with this." She listened for a moment. "Yes, we're at the facility now. Yes, we're aware there are government contractors outside. That's why we need you to run the story now, tonight, before they can suppress it." She ended the call and looked at Harold and Margaret. "That was producers from 60 Minutes. They want to do a full segment. They're sending a crew, but with the storm, they can't get here until morning." "Can we hold out that long?" Margaret asked. Harold looked out at the swirling snow. The men in the SUVs had turned on their headlights, creating circles of light in the white darkness. They weren't leaving. They were waiting. "We don't have a choice," he said. Elena continued making calls through the evening. Each conversation was carefully controlled, providing enough information to hook interest, but not enough to let anyone bury the story before it broke. Margaret found food in Vincent's quarters, canned soup and crackers that were probably years old but still edible. They heated the soup on a small electric burner and ate in silence. Outside, the storm raged. The wind howled through the mountain passes, and snow piled up against the facility's walls. At 9:32 that night, Elena's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and her expression changed. "It's Richard Torres," she said. Harold nodded. "Answer it." She put it on speaker. "Dr. Crane," Torres said. His voice was different now, tired and frustrated. "You've made a significant mistake." "Have I?" "You've sent classified materials to news organizations. That's a federal crime." "Is it still classified if the government forgot it existed for 46 years?" Elena asked. "That's not for you to determine." "Actually," Margaret spoke up, her voice clear and strong, "I think it's exactly for us to determine, because you people sure didn't." "Mrs. Fletcher," Torres said, "you don't understand what you're dealing with. Those materials, that research, it has implications beyond your comprehension." Harold leaned toward the phone. "Then maybe you should have taken better care of it. Maybe you should have listened when Vincent Crane tried to tell you it mattered." Torres was quiet for a moment. "Crane was a good man, but he was bound by the same security agreements you're now violating." "He died alone," Elena said, her voice breaking. "He died trying to make you people care, and you couldn't even be bothered to show up." Outside, the wind shrieked. Inside, the silence was absolute. Finally, Torres spoke again. "The storm will clear by morning. When it does, we're coming in. You can make this easy or hard, but we are coming in." "Then you'd better bring cameras," Harold said, "because by morning the whole world is going to be watching." He ended the call. The three of them sat in the red emergency lighting, listening to the storm. "You know they could charge us," Elena said quietly. "Theft, espionage, violation of national security statutes. We could go to prison." Harold thought about it. Then he thought about his house in Pinewood, the foreclosure notices, the bills he couldn't pay. Prison meant a roof and 3 meals a day. It didn't seem that much worse than what he already had. Margaret laughed, a sound that was half sob. "After 43 years of marriage, I never thought we'd end up as outlaws." Harold took her hand. "I never thought we'd end up as heroes either." "Is that what we are?" Margaret asked. Eleanor looked at both of them, her father's daughter, carrying his legacy forward. "My father believed that some things are worth protecting even when the world forgets them. He believed that integrity matters. He believed you, Mr. Fletcher, were the one person who would understand that. Harold felt tears on his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. Outside, the storm continued through the night. Inside, they took turns sleeping, someone always awake and watching. At 4 a.m, Harold sat by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The SUVs were buried under drifts. No movement, no lights. His phone buzzed. He had turned it back on an hour ago, and now messages were flooding in. News alerts, his sons calling, neighbors from Pinewood. One text was from the Washington Post. Story running in morning edition. Thank you for your courage. Harold showed it to Eleanor, who had just woken up. She smiled, exhausted but triumphant. We did it. Not yet, Harold said. We still have to get out of here alive. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to grey. The storm had passed, leaving everything buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Harold heard it first, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. They're coming, he said. Elena and Margaret joined him at the window, but what approached wasn't just the black SUVs digging themselves out of the snow. 3 helicopters came over the ridge. 2 were news choppers, their call letters visible on the sides. The third was unmarked but clearly government. They all landed in the clearing near the facility, rotors whipping up clouds of snow. Harold watched as men emerged from all 3, journalists with cameras, federal agents in windbreakers with FBI printed on the back, and Richard Torres, his face grim. Elena's phone rang. A producer from CB's. We're outside. Are you ready to tell your story? Harold looked at Margaret. She was pale but determined. Then he looked at Eleanor, Vincent's daughter, the one who had refused to let her father's life mean nothing. Yes, Harold said. We're ready. They opened the blast door together, stepped out into the cold morning air, into the lights of a dozen cameras, into a moment that would change everything. Richard Torres started toward them, but a federal agent stopped him. Another agent, older and clearly in charge, approached Harold instead. Mr. Fletcher, I'm Special Agent Carmen Diaz, FBI. We need to ask you some questions about what you found here. Harold nodded. I'll answer every question you have. But first, these journalists deserve to hear the story. The real story. About a man named Vincent Crane who spent 46 years protecting something he believed in, while the government that employed him forgot he existed. Agent Diaz looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Harold Fletcher, 71 years old, 3 months behind on his mortgage, married for 43 years, stood in front of the cameras and told the truth. And the world finally listened. The cameras were rolling when Harold Fletcher began to speak. His voice was steady despite the cold, despite the exhaustion, despite the federal agents and government contractors surrounding him like wolves circling prey. My name is Harold Fletcher, he said. I'm 71 years old. I worked as a mining engineer in Colorado for 37 years. 3 days ago, my wife Margaret and I received a letter from a man named Vincent Alexander Crane, who died 6 months ago at the age of 76. The journalists leaned in, microphones extended. Harold could see his reflection in a dozen camera lenses. Vincent left us coordinates to this facility and a key to get inside. He left us his life's work, 46 years of faithful service to a government that forgot he existed. Harold gestured toward the facility behind him. Inside that mountain is a vault containing approximately $295 million worth of rare earth materials, experimental technology, and research that could have advanced medical science by decades. It was all abandoned in 1979 when the government shut down a program called Project Sentinel. A reporter called out, "Why was it abandoned?" Budget cuts, Harold said. Bureaucratic reshuffling. The kind of institutional forgetting that happens when agencies reorganize and programs get lost in the paperwork. Vincent Crane was the caretaker, the lead geologist. When everyone else left, he stayed. He maintained this facility, catalogued every item, updated records, and tried for years to get someone to listen. "Did anyone respond?" another journalist asked. Harold shook his head. He filed reports, made phone calls, sent letters. Eventually, they paid him a small pension, basically to keep quiet. He took the money and stayed anyway because he believed this work mattered. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying across the clearing. "He died alone in that facility 6 months ago. A hiker found him a week later. By the time his daughter Elena could get there, the government had already removed his body. She didn't get to say goodbye." Eleanor moved beside them, her face composed but her eyes bright with emotion. "My father devoted his entire adult life to protecting something he believed the world would eventually need. He trusted Mr. Fletcher because 46 years ago, Harold was the only colleague who never questioned his dedication, who understood that some things are worth protecting even when nobody's watching." Special Agent Diaz stepped forward. "This is an ongoing federal investigation. I need to ask that you refrain from further comment until—" "With respect, Agent Diaz," Harold interrupted, "the time for silence is over. Vincent Crane was silent for 46 years, and it killed him. We're done being silent." A CBS reporter pushed to the front. "Mr. Fletcher, you're aware you could be charged with theft of government property." Harold met the camera directly. "We didn't steal anything. We inherited a legacy. There's a difference." Richard Torres tried to approach, but 2 FBI agents blocked his path. Harold could see the fury on his face, carefully controlled but burning underneath. The news helicopters stayed for 3 hours, filming everything. Journalists interviewed Harold and Margaret separately, together, asked about their background, their finances, their motivations. One reporter from the Denver Post discovered they were facing foreclosure and made that part of the story. Elderly couple risks everything to expose government waste. By noon, the story was everywhere. Harold's sons called, frantic and confused. Their father's face was on sand. What the hell was happening? Margaret spoke to them, her voice calm. "We found something important," she said. "Something worth fighting for. We'll explain everything when this is over." "If it's ever over," their oldest son said. "It will be," Margaret promised, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The FBI took formal statements from all 3 of them. Agent Diaz was professional, even sympathetic. She explained that her investigation was focused on how the facility came to be abandoned, not on prosecuting Harold and Margaret. "You understand," she said, sitting across from Harold in a makeshift interview room they'd set up in one of the facility's storage areas, that materials this valuable don't just get forgotten. Someone made decisions. Someone signed paperwork. Someone failed to follow up. My job is to find out who and why." Harold told her everything he knew, about working with Vincent in 77 and 78, about the project's sudden shutdown, about Vincent's decision to stay behind. Agent Diaz took notes, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "This is worse than I thought," she said finally. "We're talking about systemic failure across multiple agencies over multiple decades. Can you fix it?" Harold asked. She looked at him, this elderly man with grease still under his fingernails and snow melting on his coat. "I can make sure people are held accountable. I can make sure it doesn't happen again." But fixing what was lost? The research that could have been done, the lives that could have been saved with earlier access to these materials. That's beyond anyone's ability to repair. Harold felt the weight of that settle over him. Then we make sure the next 46 years are different. By evening, the story had gone viral. Hashtags were trending: forgotten facility, Vincent Crane, government waste. Social media was flooded with outrage, support, conspiracy theories, and demands for accountability. Harold sat in Vincent's hidden quarters with Margaret and Elena, watching the news coverage on the satellite system. CNN ran a segment titled, "The Man Who Waited 46 Years." They had dug up old photos of Vincent, interviewed former colleagues who remembered him as brilliant and dedicated. One man, now in his 80s, cried on camera saying he had always wondered what happened to Vincent Crane. MSNBC focused on the financial angle, how $295 million in assets got lost in bureaucratic shuffle. They interviewed budget experts and former government officials, all of whom seemed shocked that something this valuable could be forgotten. Fox News ran with the waste and corruption narrative. Your tax dollars abandoned in a mountain while a pensioner guarded it alone. But it was the human interest stories that hit hardest. A researcher from Johns Hopkins explained that some of the lithium compounds in the vault could have accelerated battery technology for medical devices by a decade. An oncologist described how the rare earth elements could have funded cancer research that might have saved thousands of lives. Vincent Crane's 46-year wait wasn't just about money. It was about lost opportunities, lost progress, lost hope. Harold watched it all with a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been forgotten, overlooked, or abandoned by systems too large to care. Margaret fell asleep around midnight, her head on his shoulder. Elena was still working, fielding calls from journalists, lawyers, government officials, and academic colleagues. Harold stepped outside. The snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared. Stars filled the darkness, brilliant and cold. Richard Torres was still there, standing beside one of the black SUVs, smoking a cigarette. When he saw Harold, he flicked it away and approached. "You've made this very complicated," he said. "It was already complicated," Harold replied. "We just made it visible." Torres studied him. "You know they're going to try to take it all back, classify everything again, bury it deeper this time." Harold shook his head. "Too late. The files are out there. Hundreds of copies. Thousands by now. You can't classify sunshine." Torres almost smiled. "That's naive." "Maybe," Harold said, "but I'm 71 years old and about to lose my house. I've got nothing to lose and everything to gain by being naive. What do you want, Fletcher?" Harold thought about that. "I want Vincent Crane's name remembered. I want his daughter to receive what he was owed. I want the materials used for something good instead of rotting in a mountain. And I want enough money to pay my wife's medical bills and keep our home." "That's all?" Harold met his eyes. "That's everything." Torres was quiet for a long moment. "What if I told you there was a way to make this work? Something that doesn't end with you in prison and everything classified again?" Harold waited. "The problem," Torres said, "is that too many people know now. We can't make it disappear, but we can control how it's resolved. A negotiated settlement, proper channels, legal sale of materials with proceeds distributed appropriately. Why would you help with that?" Torres laughed bitterly. "Because if I don't, my superiors will try to seize everything through force, and with every camera in America watching, that will be a PR disaster of epic proportions. Better to manage this, spin it as the government making things right, recovering from past mistakes." Harold considered. What would a settlement look like? Torres pulled out his phone, pulled up a document. "I've been drafting something. Pending approval from people way above my pay grade. 1/3 of proceeds to the government, recovering their initial investment in the materials. 1/3 to Vincent Crane's estate, compensation for his years of service. 1/3 to you and Mrs. Fletcher, in recognition of your role in bringing this to light." Harold's mind raced. 1/3 of $295 million. That was $98 million. "Margaret and I don't need $98 million, he said. Torres raised an eyebrow. "Most people would disagree. Most people aren't from Pinewood, Colorado," Harold said. "Here's my counteroffer. 1/3 to the government, 1/3 to Elena Crane, and 1/3 to establish a foundation for my town and others like it. Job training, education, medical support, the things that disappeared when the economy did." "You're serious?" Harold nodded. Vincent spent 46 years protecting this because he believed it could help people. Making me rich doesn't help people. Building something that lasts does. Torres studied him for a long moment. You really are naive. Or maybe I'm the only one here who understands what Vincent was trying to teach us, Harold said. The next morning, Harold woke to find his phone flooded with messages. Friend requests on Facebook from people he'd never met. Interview requests from every major news network. And one email that made his heart stop. It was from the president of Pinewoods Community Bank. Mr. Fletcher, in light of recent events and your national profile, the bank has decided to suspend foreclosure proceedings on your property pending resolution of your current situation. We apologize for any inconvenience. Harold showed it to Margaret. She read it twice, then started crying. We're not losing the house, she whispered. Harold held her, both of them shaking with relief and exhaustion. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold became an unlikely celebrity. His face was on magazine covers. Late-night talk shows made jokes about the elderly outlaw couple. But mostly, the coverage was sympathetic, even admiring. 60 Minutes ran their segment. It was powerful, emotional, and devastating in its revelation of bureaucratic failure. They interviewed Harold and Margaret at length, intercut with footage of the facility and Vincent's meticulous records. The segment ended with Eleanor Crane standing in the vault, surrounded by the materials her father had protected. My father wasn't a hero, she said, tears streaming down her face. He was just a man who believed in doing his job right, and for 46 years he did exactly that while the people who employed him forgot he existed. If that doesn't make us question our priorities as a society, I don't know what will. The segment got 42 million views in the first week. Public pressure became overwhelming. Senators called for investigations. The head of the Department of Energy was forced to testify before Congress about how materials this valuable could be abandoned. Bureaucrats pointed fingers at each other, each claiming the failure happened on someone else's watch. Through it all, Harold and Margaret stayed in a hotel in Denver, provided by CBS News in exchange for exclusive access. Elena stayed with them, the three of them forming an unlikely family bound by circumstance and purpose. Lawyers descended. So many lawyers. Some representing the government, some representing Harold and Margaret, some representing various companies that wanted access to the materials. Harold chose his representation carefully. He hired a firm known for environmental law and indigenous rights, lawyers who understood fighting systems bigger than themselves. The lead attorney, a woman named Sarah Morrison, laid out their strategy. We push for a settlement that maximizes public benefit while protecting your interests. We use media pressure to keep everything transparent. And we make sure Vincent Crane's story doesn't get buried in the legal maneuvering. 6 weeks after Harold and Margaret opened that vault, a settlement was reached. The announcement was made at a press conference in Washington, D.C. Harold and Margaret stood beside Elena, all three of them looking uncomfortable in borrowed formal clothes. The Secretary of the Interior read the terms. After extensive negotiation and review, the following settlement has been reached regarding materials recovered from the former Project Sentinel facility. The materials will be legally sold through transparent public auction to qualified buyers in the technology, medical research, and materials science sectors. Proceeds, estimated at $295 million, will be divided as follows. Harold watched the cameras, the reporters scribbling notes, the officials trying to look like they had everything under control. 1/3 will return to the federal treasury, offsetting the original investment in Project Sentinel. 1/3 will be paid to the estate of Vincent Alexander Crane in recognition of his 46 years of faithful service. And 1/3 will fund the establishment of the Sentinel Foundation, dedicated to job training, education, and community revitalization in economically depressed areas, with priority given to former mining communities. The room erupted in questions. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Fletcher, you're giving away $98 million. Harold stepped to the microphone. Margaret and I will receive a modest finder's fee, Enough to settle our debts and live comfortably. The rest goes to building something that lasts. That's what Vincent would have wanted. Another reporter, Mrs. Crane. How do you feel about this settlement? Elena's voice was steady. My father died believing his work didn't matter. This proves it did. Not just the materials he protected, but the example he set. Integrity matters. Dedication matters. One person can make a difference if they refuse to give up. What will you do with your inheritance? Someone asked. Eleanor smiled. I'm establishing a museum dedicated to forgotten government workers, the people who keep systems running while nobody notices. Custodians, maintainers, record keepers. The Vincent A. Crane Memorial Museum will tell their stories and honor their service. The press conference lasted 2 hours. By the end, Harold was exhausted but at peace. That night, he and Margaret had dinner alone for the first time in weeks, just the two of them in a quiet restaurant, holding hands across the table. We did it, Margaret said softly. Vincent did it, Harold corrected. We just made sure people noticed. She squeezed his hand. What happens now? Now we go home, Harold said. Back to Pinewood. Back to our life. It won't be the same life, Margaret said. Harold smiled. No, I suppose it won't. The materials were auctioned over the next 3 months. Technology companies bid on the rare earth elements. Medical research institutions competed for the experimental compounds. Universities purchased the superconductor prototypes for study. The final total exceeded expectations, $312 million. The Sentinel Foundation was established with Harold as honorary chairman, but run by professionals who knew community development. Their first project was Pinewood, Colorado. Harold and Margaret returned to find their town cautiously hopeful. The bank had officially cleared their mortgage, paid in full by the finder's fee portion of the settlement. They had enough left over to never worry about money again, though by most standards they still lived modestly. But the real change was in Pinewood itself. The foundation's first investment was a job training center, teaching welding, electrical work, computer programming, and renewable energy installation. Young people who had left started coming back. Next came a medical clinic, fully staffed and funded, where Margaret volunteered 3 days a week. Her own medical bills were cleared, and she used her nursing experience to help others. The old hardware store reopened as a community center. The boarded-up diner became a farm-to-table restaurant that employed 16 people. Solar panels appeared on rooftops, funded by foundation grants. 6 months after the settlement, the foundation announced a partnership with 3 major tech companies who wanted access to the rare earth materials. In exchange for preferential pricing, they agreed to open a processing facility in Pinewood. 200 new jobs with training provided. Harold was hired as a consultant, his engineering expertise finally recognized and valued. He spent his days reviewing safety protocols and teaching young workers about proper materials handling. Elena's museum opened in Denver to critical acclaim. The Vincent A. Crane Memorial Museum for Unsung Public Servants became a destination for school groups and tourists. Interactive exhibits told the stories of dam inspectors, bridge maintenance workers, archive clerks, all the people who kept society functioning while receiving no recognition. The centerpiece was Vincent's story, told through his journals, photographs, and artifacts from the facility. Visitors could see his workbench, his tools, his meticulous records. A video played on loop, interviews with Harold and Margaret and Elena explaining what his dedication had meant. On the 6-month anniversary of the settlement, a groundbreaking ceremony was held in Pinewood for a new community center. It would be named the Vincent A. Crane Center for Community Resilience. The governor came, senators attended. Cameras from 3 networks were there, but the crowd was mostly local people, Pinewood residents who had watched their town dying and now dared to hope it might live. Harold stood at the podium, looking out at familiar faces. His sons were there with their families. Margaret sat in the front row, her eyes shining. Eleanor stood beside the governor, representing her father. Harold cleared his throat. 6 months ago, my wife and I thought we were buying gas and a map for a wild goose chase. We thought we'd drive into the mountains, find nothing, and come home to figure out how to lose our house gracefully. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Instead, we found Vincent Crane's legacy. Not just the materials he protected, not just the research he maintained, but something more important. We found proof that integrity matters, that dedication matters, that one person refusing to give up can change the world. Harold paused, emotion thick in his throat. Vincent Crane spent 46 years in that mountain, believing someone would eventually care. He was right, and now, because of his faith and his work, this town has a future again. He looked at the crowd, at the young faces mixed with the old, at the hope replacing despair. This center isn't just a building, it's a promise that we won't forget the people who keep faith when times are hard. A promise that integrity still matters in a world that often rewards shortcuts and selfishness. A promise that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they refuse to quit. Applause filled the air, growing louder. Harold stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed. Margaret came to the podium next. She hadn't planned to speak, but she found words anyway. My husband is right about everything he said, but I want to add something. For 43 years, Harold and I have lived small, careful lives. We did what we were supposed to do, worked hard, raised our kids, paid our bills when we could. We never took risks. We never made waves. She looked at Harold, her eyes bright. 6 months ago, we took a risk. We drove into the mountains following a dead man's letter because we were desperate enough to hope. And that one risk, that one moment of courage changed everything. Her voice grew stronger. So my message is this. Don't wait until you're desperate to take risks. Don't wait until you have nothing to lose before you fight for something better. The greatest adventures, the most important discoveries, they don't come from playing it safe. They come from being brave enough to open the door when you have no idea what's on the other side. The crowd rose to its feet. Margaret stepped back, surprised by the response, and Harold took her hand. Eleanor spoke last, her voice carrying the same quiet intensity her father had possessed. My father never got to see this day. He never got to know that his 46 years of lonely dedication would matter to anyone. But he believed it would. He had faith that the right person would find what he protected and do the right thing. She looked directly at Harold and Margaret. Mr. Fletcher, Mrs. Fletcher, you were the right people. You proved my father's faith was justified. And on behalf of the Crane family, on behalf of everyone who has ever felt forgotten or overlooked, thank you. The ceremony ended with the first shovel of dirt turned, children from the local school waving flags, and a sense of possibility in the air that Pinewood hadn't felt in decades. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Harold and Margaret sat on the porch of their small house. The one they no longer had to worry about losing. They held hands, watching the light fade from gold to purple. You know, Margaret said softly, I still can't believe this is real. Harold squeezed her hand. Me neither. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Margaret spoke again. What do you think Vincent would say if he could see all this? Harold thought about the lonely man in the mountain, updating records no one read, maintaining equipment no one used, believing against all evidence that his work mattered. I think he'd say he always knew someone would care eventually. He just didn't know it would take 46 years. Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. Was it worth it, for him, I mean, dying alone like that? Harold considered. Up in the mountains, spring was coming. He could see green beginning to show on the hillsides. Down in town, lights were coming on in houses. The diner was open, families eating together. The community center was hosting a youth basketball game, laughter and shouts echoing through the evening. Yeah, Harold said finally. I think it was, because he didn't die alone. He died believing. And that belief, that stubborn, faithful dedication, It ended up saving a whole town. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It saved us too." Harold looked at his wife, this woman who had stood beside him for 43 years through poverty and hardship and fear, who had climbed into that dark tunnel and run through the forest and faced cameras and lawyers without flinching, who had found courage when she needed it most. "Yes," he said, "it saved us too." A car drove by, slowing down. The driver, a young man Harold recognized from the job training center, waved. Harold waved back. 3 months later, the Sentinel Foundation announced it was expanding to 6 more former mining towns across Colorado, Montana, and West Virginia. Each would receive the same comprehensive support: job training, medical facilities, educational programs, small business grants. Harold became the face of the foundation despite his protests. He gave speeches, attended fundraisers, met with community leaders. Everywhere he went, people thanked him for giving them hope. But he always redirected the thanks. "Vincent Crane gave you hope," he would say. "I just made sure people noticed." Elena's museum partnered with the Smithsonian for a traveling exhibit about unsung public servants. Vincent's story became the centerpiece, but it grew to include thousands of others. The night janitor who had prevented a chemical spill by noticing an unusual smell. The filing clerk who had preserved documents that later proved crucial to a civil rights case. The bridge inspector who had insisted on emergency repairs despite budget pressure, preventing a collapse that would have killed dozens. All the invisible people who kept the world running. All the Vincent Cranes who never got recognition. A year after the settlement, Harold and Margaret celebrated their 44th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren came to Pinewood for a big party at the new community center. Their oldest son pulled Harold aside. "Dad, I need to apologize. When this first happened, I thought you'd lost your mind. I was embarrassed, but you were right about all of it." Harold hugged him. "You don't need to apologize for worrying about your old man. I'm proud of you," his son said. "You and Mom both. You did something incredible." Harold shook his head. "We did what needed doing, that's all." But that night, lying in bed beside Margaret, Harold allowed himself to feel proud. Not of the money or the attention or the recognition, but of the fact that when the moment came, when the choice had to be made, he had chosen right. He had honored Vincent's trust. He had protected what mattered. He had made sure 46 years of faithful service hadn't been wasted. And in doing so, he had discovered something about himself, that even at 71, even broke and desperate and scared, he still had the capacity for courage, for integrity, for standing up when it would have been easier to walk away. Margaret stirred beside him. "You awake?" she whispered. "Yeah. What are you thinking about?" Harold smiled in the darkness. "I'm thinking about a 75-cent cup of gas station coffee and a map we could barely read, about how the smallest decisions can change everything." Margaret rolled over to face him. "Would you do it again? Knowing everything that happened?" Harold didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Even the scary parts?" "Especially the scary parts," Harold said. "Because the scary parts meant we were doing something that mattered." They lay together in the quiet house in the small town that was learning to hope again, under the same stars that had watched over Vincent Crane for 46 lonely years. And somewhere in that vast darkness, Harold liked to think Vincent was finally resting, knowing that his faith had been justified, that his work had mattered, that someone had cared. 2 years later, Pinewood's population had grown from 2,000 to 4,000. Young families were moving in, attracted by the jobs and the community spirit and the sense that this was a place where ordinary people could build extraordinary things. The old saying that it takes a village had been reversed in Pinewood. Here, a village had been taken apart by economic forces beyond its control. And then it had been rebuilt piece by piece by the legacy of one man's dedication and two people's courage. Harold and Margaret still lived in their small house with the porch swing. They didn't need anything bigger. They had enough. But enough meant something different now. It meant security, dignity, purpose, the ability to help others, the satisfaction of knowing they had made a difference. Eleanor visited often, bringing updates about the museum and the foundation. She had become the keeper of her father's legacy, making sure his story inspired others to have faith even in dark times. On what would have been Vincent's 78th birthday, they held a memorial service at the facility in the mountains. It had been preserved as a historic site, a monument to faithful service and bureaucratic failure. Harold stood in the vault where he had first discovered the fortune, where Vincent had spent decades maintaining equipment and updating records and believing someone would eventually care. He placed his hand on the wall, cold stone and concrete. "Thank you," he said simply, "for believing in me, for trusting me with this, for showing me that integrity matters even when nobody's watching." The memorial service drew over 300 people, former government workers who had heard Vincent's story and felt seen for the first time. Young people from the communities the foundation had helped, journalists who had covered the story, and dozens of Pinewood residents whose lives had been transformed. Elena gave the main eulogy, standing in the same underground chamber where her father had spent so much of his life. She spoke about his dedication, his loneliness, his unwavering belief that his work would eventually matter. "My father was not a perfect man," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "He was distant. He was obsessive. He chose this place over his family more times than I can count. But he was also the most honest person I've ever known. He never cut corners. He never gave up. And when the world forgot about him, he didn't forget about the world." She paused, looking around at the faces watching her. "This facility is now a National Historic Site. Tourists come here to see what one man's dedication can achieve. Students study my father's records to learn about rare earth materials and Cold War research. But I hope they also learn something else." She looked directly at Harold and Margaret. "I hope they learn that it's never too late to do the right thing, that courage can come at any age, and that sometimes the people who change the world aren't the ones who start the work, they're the ones who finish it." The crowd was silent. Then someone began to clap, then another. Within moments the vault was filled with applause echoing off stone walls, a sound Vincent Crane had never heard in 46 years, but had always hoped might come someday. After the service, Harold walked through the facility one more time. Workers from the National Park Service were installing exhibits, turning Vincent's workplace into a museum. They had preserved everything exactly as it was. The desk with its careful notations, the tools hung on their pegboards, the cot where Vincent had slept between maintenance checks. Harold stopped at the desk and opened the journal he had found months ago. He flipped to a blank page near the end and pulled a pen from his pocket. "Vincent," he wrote, "you were right. Someone did care. And because you never gave up, hundreds of thousands of people now have hope they didn't have before. Your 46 years weren't wasted. They were the most important investment anyone ever made. Thank you for trusting me. Harold Fletcher." He closed the journal and placed it back on the desk exactly where he had found it. Outside, the Colorado sun was bright on the snow. Harold found Margaret talking with Eleanor near the Jeep. They were looking at architectural plans for an expansion of the museum. "They want to add a wing," Elena explained, showing Harold the drawings, dedicated to modern-day forgotten workers, sanitation workers, home health aides, delivery drivers, all the people who keep society running but never get recognized. Harold studied the plans. His engineering eye noticed the structural challenges, but his heart saw something more important. Vincent's story spreading, his example multiplying. "How much will it cost?" he asked. Elena smiled. The foundation already approved the funding. Turns out there are a lot of people who want to honor invisible workers. Margaret linked her arm through Harold's. We should get back to town. You're teaching that welding class at 4. Harold checked his watch. A gift from the foundation, though he still preferred his old Casio. Right, almost forgot. On the drive back, they passed through mountain towns in various states of recovery. Some had received foundation support and showed signs of renewal. Others were still waiting, still hoping, still dying slowly. Harold made a note to mention them at the next foundation board meeting. Back in Pinewood, the transformation was impossible to miss. The main street that had been half boarded up 2 years ago now bustled with activity. New businesses had opened, a bookstore, a coffee shop, a climbing gear outfitter taking advantage of the nearby mountains. The population had stabilized at just over 4,000. The school had hired 6 new teachers. The medical clinic saw patients from 3 surrounding counties. And everywhere, on signs and letterheads and the sides of buildings, was a small notation, supported by the Sentinel Foundation in honor of Vincent Crane. Harold's welding class had 12 students, ranging from 18 to 63. He taught them proper technique, safety protocols, and the importance of doing work that would last. One student, a young woman named Casey, who had moved back to Pinewood after losing her job in Denver, stayed after class. Mr. Fletcher, she said, I wanted to thank you. Not just for the class, but for everything. My parents were about to lose their house before the foundation helped them. My dad works at the processing plant now. My mom's getting treatment at the clinic for her diabetes. We have hope again. Harold felt his throat tighten. You don't need to thank me. Thank Vincent Crane. Thank yourself for coming back home when it would have been easier to give up. Casey smiled. My dad says you could have taken the money and moved somewhere fancy. Why didn't you? Harold thought about that. Because fancy doesn't mean anything if you're alone, and Pinewood isn't just a town, it's people, it's family, it's home. That evening, Harold and Margaret hosted dinner for Elena and several foundation board members. They ate simple food around the same kitchen table where Harold had first read Vincent's letter. The conversation turned to expansion plans. The foundation had requests from 43 communities across 12 states. They couldn't help everyone, but they were trying. One board member, a former economics professor, raised a concern. We're running at capacity. If we want to help more communities, we need to either raise more funds or become more efficient. Or, Elena suggested, we teach communities to help themselves. Create a model they can replicate without foundation support. Harold nodded. Vincent didn't just maintain that facility. He created systems, protocols, ways of doing things that would last. We should do the same. Over the next 6 months, that's exactly what they did. The foundation developed a comprehensive guide: how to assess community needs, how to organize local support, how to attract investment, how to build sustainable programs. They called it the Crane Protocol. Communities that followed it saw remarkable results. Jobs returned. Schools improved. Hope replaced despair. And always at the center of the story was Vincent Crane, the man who had waited, the man who had believed, the man who had shown that dedication mattered even when nobody was watching. 3 years after opening the vault, Harold received an invitation to speak at the United Nations. They were hosting a summit on sustainable community development, and they wanted Harold to explain how Pinewood had transformed. He almost declined. The idea of speaking to diplomats and world leaders terrified him. But Margaret convinced him. Vincent's story deserves the biggest audience possible, she said, and you're the one who can tell it. So Harold went to New York. He stood in front of representatives from 193 countries and told them about a forgotten facility, a loyal caretaker, and a brass key that had opened more than a vault. He talked about integrity over convenience, about faith over cynicism, about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. When he finished, the assembly hall was silent. Then someone started clapping, the delegate from Norway, then someone else. Within moments, the entire assembly was on its feet. Harold stood at the podium, overwhelmed, thinking about the engineer he had been 3 years ago. Broke, scared, about to lose everything. He thought about the choice he and Margaret had made to drive into the mountains, to open that door, to honor a dead man's trust. And he thought about Vincent, alone in that facility for 46 years, never knowing his dedication would eventually inspire the world. After the speech, Harold was swarmed by delegates wanting to know more. How could they replicate the model in their countries? What resources did they need? Could the foundation help? Harold gave them all the same answer. Read the Crane Protocol. Follow the principles. Have faith that doing the right thing will eventually matter. Back in Pinewood, life continued its remarkable transformation. The town that had been dying was now a model for economic renewal. Researchers came to study it. Journalists wrote about it. Politicians visited to take credit for it. Harold and Margaret stayed in their small house with the porch swing. They were in their mid-70s now, moving slower, tiring easier, but still showing up. Harold still taught welding twice a week. Margaret still volunteered at the clinic. They still held hands on the porch swing while watching the sunset over mountains that no longer seemed quite so overwhelming. One evening, their grandson, Tyler, now 16, came to visit. He had a school project about personal heroes and wanted to interview Harold. "Grandpa," Tyler asked, recording on his phone, "what made you decide to go into that mountain? Weren't you scared?" Harold thought about that dark stairwell, the unknown vault, the men in tactical gear hunting them through the forest. "Terrified," he said honestly. "But sometimes being scared is how you know something matters. But you could have died. Or gone to prison." Harold nodded. "We could have. But we also could have done nothing. Could have thrown away Vincent's letter, stayed home, lost our house quietly. That scared me more, the idea of giving up without trying." Tyler was quiet for a moment. "So courage isn't about not being scared?" Harold smiled. "Courage is being scared and doing it anyway. Courage is believing that something matters more than your own comfort. Courage is trusting that doing the right thing will work out even when you can't see how." "What's the right thing?" Tyler asked. Harold looked at his grandson, this young man trying to figure out how to live in a complicated world. "The right thing is usually the hard thing. The thing that costs you something. The thing that makes you vulnerable. But it's also the thing that lets you sleep at night. The thing that makes you proud when you look in the mirror." Tyler nodded slowly, absorbing this. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Harold felt tears prick his eyes. "Don't be like me. Be like Vincent. Be the kind of person who keeps faith even when nobody's watching. Be the kind of person who does the work because it matters, not because someone's paying attention." Later, after Tyler left, Margaret found Harold in the garage, looking through old boxes. He had pulled out the folder Vincent had left, the one with all the documents and valuations. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Harold held up a photograph. It showed Vincent as a young man, maybe 30, standing in front of the facility when it was new. He was smiling, proud, full of hope. "I'm looking for this guy," Harold said, "the one who believed his work would change the world, before 46 years of loneliness wore him down." Margaret sat beside him. "Do you think he ever regretted it, staying up there all that time?" Harold studied the photo. "I think he had moments of doubt. Everyone does. But I also think he knew, deep down, that he was doing something important, and that knowledge kept him going." "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Getting involved in all this?" Harold looked at his wife, at the woman who had run through a dark forest with him, who had stood in front of cameras, who had risked everything because she trusted him. "Not for a second," he said. 4 years after opening the vault, The Sentinel Foundation had helped transform 29 communities across 8 states. Over 14,000 jobs had been created. 42,000 people had received job training. Medical clinics served 170,000 patients annually. And at the center of every facility, every program, every initiative was a plaque in honor of Vincent Alexander Crane, who showed us that dedication matters. Elena's museum had grown to include 3 locations: Denver, Washington, D.C., and a new branch in Pinewood itself, built right into the old hardware store where Harold used to buy parts. The museum received over 250,000 visitors a year. School groups, families, tourists, people seeking inspiration. They came to see Vincent's story, but they left thinking about their own lives, about what they were willing to dedicate themselves to, about whether they had the courage to keep faith when things got hard. Harold visited the museum often. He would walk through the exhibits, reading the stories of forgotten workers, seeing their faces, learning their names. One day, he found a new exhibit being installed. It was a recreation of his and Margaret's living room, complete with the wobbly kitchen table where he had first opened Vincent's letter. The placard read, "Courage begins in ordinary places." This is the kitchen where Harold and Margaret Fletcher made the choice that would change thousands of lives. They didn't know what they would find. They didn't know if they would succeed. They just knew they had to try. Harold stood there for a long time, staring at that ordinary table, thinking about all the moments of his life that had led to that morning, all the choices, all the struggles, all the near misses that had somehow aligned to put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Or maybe it wasn't luck at all. Maybe Vincent had known exactly who he was leaving his legacy to. Maybe those 46 years of lonely dedication had been leading to this moment all along. Eleanor found him there, lost in thought. Harold smiled, just remembering. Seems like a lifetime ago. "It's been 4 years," Elena said, "but also, yes, it does feel like a lifetime." They stood together, looking at the recreated kitchen. "How's your mother?" Harold asked. Elena's mother had remarried and moved to Florida, far from the mountains that held so many painful memories. "She's good," Elena said. "Happy. She told me last week that she's glad Dad's story finally got told, that people finally understand he wasn't crazy or obsessive. He was just committed." Harold nodded. "The world needs more committed people." "It has them," Elena said. "They're everywhere. They just need to be seen. That's what this museum does. It makes invisible people visible." As they walked through the exhibits together, Harold realized that Vincent's legacy wasn't just the materials he had protected or the money they had generated. It was the reminder that every person matters, every job matters, every act of dedication ripples outward in ways we can't always see. The night janitor preventing a chemical spill, the bridge inspector preventing a collapse, the filing clerk preserving crucial documents, and yes, the geologist maintaining a forgotten facility for 46 years, all of them keeping faith, all of them doing the work, all of them believing it mattered even when nobody was watching. 5 years after opening the vault, Harold and Margaret celebrated their 48th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at the Farm-to-Table restaurant in Pinewood. The owner, a young woman who had returned to town after receiving foundation training, refused to let them pay. "You two are the reason I have a restaurant," she said. "The reason I have a life here." Harold tried to argue, but Margaret stopped him. "Just say thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," Harold said. They sat by the window, watching people walk past on the rebuilt main street. Families, couples, young people who had futures here again. "We're 76 now," Margaret said suddenly. Harold looked at her. Same age Vincent was when he died. She nodded. "Do you think about that?" Harold thought about Vincent, alone in that facility, his heart giving out with no one there to help. He thought about dying in service of something you believed in, about whether that was tragic or noble or both. "I think about it," he admitted, "but I also think we're different. Vincent died alone, but his work gave him meaning. We have each other. We have our family. We have this town, and we have the satisfaction of knowing we finished what he started." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were thin and fragile now, marked with age spots and arthritis, but her grip was still strong. "I love you," she said. "For 48 years, through everything, I love you." Harold squeezed back, his own eyes wet. "I love you too, and I'm grateful for all of it, even the scary parts." "Especially the scary parts," Margaret corrected, smiling. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had lived a full life together, who had faced poverty and illness and fear, who had taken one enormous risk and seen it transform not just their own lives, but thousands of others. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Harold Fletcher allowed himself to feel complete. Not finished, not ready to stop, but complete, whole. At peace with the choices he had made and the life he had lived. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to stand their ground and brave enough to speak the truth, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let something important be forgotten. As the evening deepened and stars began to appear over the rebuilt town, Harold Fletcher sat on his porch for the last time in this story, but not in his life. He watched his town, alive and growing, filled with hope and possibility. Margaret brought him coffee, the good kind now, not gas station brew, and sat beside him. They didn't need to speak. After 48 years of marriage, after everything they had been through, silence was still comfortable. But Harold thought about the journey, about a brass key and coordinates and a leap of faith, about a lonely man in a mountain and a fortune worth millions and a choice between self-interest and service. He thought about all the Vincent Cranes in the world, keeping faith, doing their jobs, maintaining integrity while nobody watched. And he hoped that somewhere, somehow, they knew their work mattered. Because it did. God, it did. The mechanic who once questioned if he mattered had become the man who proved that everyone does. The nurse who had patched wounds had learned to heal communities, and the geologist who died alone had posthumously reminded the world that some things are worth protecting even when the cost is everything. For Harold and Margaret and Elena and all the people whose lives they touched, the real treasure was never the $295 million. It was the reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, that integrity matters, that dedication counts, that one person refusing to give up can change everything, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you're desperate enough to hope and brave enough to turn the key, even when you have no idea what waits on the other side. The stars continued to emerge one by one until the sky was full of them. Harold and Margaret sat together, hands clasped, watching the universe unfold above their small town that had learned to dream again. Somewhere up in those mountains, the facility still stood, a monument now, preserved for future generations. And somewhere in the darkness, Harold imagined Vincent's spirit finally at rest. 46 years of waiting vindicated. 46 years of faith rewarded. The light in the windows of Pinewood burned bright against the night. Inside those homes were families who had jobs again, children who had futures again, hope that had been resurrected from the dead. All because one man had refused to abandon his post, and two others had refused to abandon his legacy. Harold closed his eyes, breathing in the mountain air, feeling Margaret's warmth beside him, and whispered one final thank you to the man who had believed. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice.